So I would love to begin this conversation, Peter, by talking about the difference between immediate return societies and delayed return societies and the concept of limited competition. So how can we look back at these early societies and how they actually lived?
So in the 1970s, an anthropologist named James Woodburn coined the term immediate return and delayed return society based on his observations of different bands of hunter-gatherers. Oftentimes, you may read a news article or see a headline or something that's hunter-gatherers were more egalitarian. And then you might see some that are, no, that's not true. Here's an example of a violent group of hunter-gatherers or whatever. Really what it comes down to is understanding this distinction between delayed return societies and immediate return societies. And the difference is the way that the terminology comes from is immediate return means immediate return on investment for energy expended to get the food that you need for subsistence. So basically, you go out one day, you spend a couple of hours gathering food, you bring it back to your base camp and you eat it. That's immediate return. You're getting that return on the investment for calories expended. Delayed return is you go out, you gather a bunch of stuff, and then you come back and you store it for a long period of time, and you slowly eat that food storage. And what he noticed was that there were two very distinct forms of hunter-gatherer societies. One that stored their food for longer term periods, and one that didn't store food really at all. That's not to say that they weren't caching some food, but that the food storage distinction is between those who basically seasonally passively bury food to like hide it, and those that build basically granaries to prevent it from being consumed by other things. And so you have this sort of distinction made that then shows psychological and social changes within the societies. So when you have a delayed return society, there's an increase in violence between members of that society, and really an increase in what you might consider violence or consumption or environmental destruction between delayed return societies and their environments. Because if there's a larder of food, if there's a food surplus, things want to eat it. So if your food is just stored in quotes, if it's just growing out in the forest or the wilds and you go on a daily basis and gather it, you're not having to guard that food. You're not preventing other things from getting it. But as soon as you accumulate it and start to store it, now you have to prevent other things from getting that food too, other people, but also other animals and plants and things that want to consume it. So this is how this notion of cats so-called domesticated themselves, for example. They became members of what's called the domus, which is a larger anthropological, archaeological collection, an assemblage of technologies and culture that we call the domus. You can read a really good book called Against the Grain by James Scott. He kind of talks about the domus. But basically, every animal, the way it's consuming, the way it's interacting in the world, leaves some disturbances behind. And other animals adapt to those disturbances. And so basically, there's a regeneration and a disturbance. Different subsistence strategies have different levels of disturbance, and animals adapt to those disturbances. So if you have a food storage society, a delayed return society, for example, and they're storing grain, that's going to attract other animals that want that surplus. So you have a mouse problem, and then other wild animals are going to start coming closer to the sedentary society to eat those mice. You're creating, and so you're seeing a wake of ecological transformations. This notion of cats being domesticated, they really just became more pro-social towards humans because they were around them more often, because humans had created a surplus of grain that created a surplus of sedentary mice, which then made the cats come in. And over time, they just became more comfortable around humans. And then humans realized they could, if you look at it from permaculture principles, they could incorporate cats into their ecological framework to prevent grain loss by the consumption of mice. So this, sorry, I'm going to go on lots of tangents. It's sort of the nature of my work is very nonlinear, but it all kind of strings together into a mosaic.
In the chat that I think is worth, it says, what about cultures that lived in harsher winter environments? Were they all delayed return because they had to store food? Or is it
some of them? So there's going to be gray areas. It's a really hard thing to just draw a circle and label a society as a specific thing. These are strategies that all humans have been sort of using and letting go of for probably, I want to say, 90,000 years. So yes, some groups that were storing food over the winter, for example, they became delayed return for that period of time, and then maybe switched back to immediate return during different seasons, right? The main distinction that I think is important to note is that you see that caching food seasonally, the way a squirrel buries a nut in the ground, the squirrel isn't having to sit on top of where it buried it and guard that nut from being eaten by anything else. It's passively, it's buried it, it's invisible now, and it's only doing this in a seasonal manner. It's not thinking about, if I always store food, I'll just always have food to eat. It's not thinking in this sort of long-term concept of delayed return society where it's actually going to be storing food for long periods of time. And so there's definitely competition that exists between different societies that are storing food in this manner. But we evolved in the subtropics where food storage wasn't, or in the savannas, food storage wasn't an issue. There was food year round. And as soon as you start to see that delayed return society, which is potentially anywhere starting 90,000 years ago and up until now.
This is a really interesting distinction, and I think people need to understand this, which is that something happens 90,000 years ago, which requires people. So outside of moral binaries of aggressive or good or bad, 90,000 years ago, the face of the earth changes drastically, and it means that people have to experiment with different types of subsistence. And so we talk a little bit about that shift because it's really interesting. It's probably the first step towards agriculture, and it's because people were looking for new ways to survive.
So anytime an animal figures out a new thing to eat in its environment, or specifically with humans, we call it intensification. So stone tool production 3 million years ago, humans started bashing bones of megafauna that were left behind by other megafauna who couldn't break into them. We didn't evolve biologically to have fangs or claws the way other omnivorous predatory animals did. We evolved technologically. So as soon as we had a rock in our hand, that was our fangs and our claws in order to break open those bones. That form of intensification gave us access to calories that didn't exist in our diet before. All of a sudden you have basically a bone filled with butter. I mean, it's super fatty, super high in calories. And so that's a form of intensification. The further along this sort of line we go, there's new methods of intensification. Fire was a method of intensification. It allowed us to unlock calories in the environment that we couldn't access before by cooking food. So we could cook roots, potatoes, for example, or cook even rotten or spoiled meat. Now, all of a sudden, we're getting all of these, a lot more calories from the environment. And anytime that happens, anytime there's a new surplus of food, a population will grow to meet it. So we see this sort of slow progression of humans' population increasing globally with new methods of consumption. Something happens at some point in our past. No idea when this happened or how. Daniel Quinn, he's a very good author. His book Ishmael is a fictional nonfiction book. In his work, he hypothesized this thing that he called the law of limited competition. And this is also the law of life. Basically, what it says is that living things can compete to the best of their abilities among each other, but you can't wage war or seek out and destroy your competitors or deny them access to food. So essentially a bear that's eating salmon out of a river, actually, they really only eat the brains of the salmon and then they throw the rest of it on the side of the river. But a bear doesn't think to itself, if I kill all of the fox who are also eating salmon, then I can have all of the fish for myself. A bear isn't going to wage war on the foxes. They're also not going to deny them access to food. They're not going to build dams around the whole river. They might compete a little bit. A bear might be, I'm eating right here. And a fox might just have to go down the river or come back the next day. But they're not going to compete. They're not going to wage war on each other. And they're not going to deny each other access to food indefinitely. And at some point in the human history, this form of this happened. Humans broke the law of limited competition. And we see that in food storage is one of the methods of breaking the law of limited competition. It's different than caching food. It's denying access to the food. So there's a difference between hiding your food underground versus standing on top of it and not letting anybody get it ever all the time. So at one point in time, 12,000 years ago, there were reindeer hunters in Eurasia and they followed the herds, but eventually something happened. They decided to break the law of limited competition and become reindeer herders. And if you think about it, that transformation, what is a herder versus a hunter? A herder is quote unquote protecting a bunch of animals from other predators. So what's happening there is humans decided to deny access to the food from other predators and keep that food for themselves. So you see this form, this is essentially the origins of domestication, is this idea of bringing food storage in, and food storage could be in an agrarian sense or a plant sense. You can't move it. It's a sedentary form of food storage in a granary. But animal agriculture is different. Animal agriculture is mobile. So you can have that mobile food storage. But among both of those societies, we see an increase in violence, which is funny, or not funny, but this is where the story of Cain and Abel comes from, is this notion of these two different forms of agriculture, animal agriculture and plant agriculture, coming head to head against one another. Because agriculture, plant agriculture, was always susceptible to the military advantage of mobile animal agriculture, which could come in, make a strike, steal food, and then disappear. But if you have to stay in a sedentary place, you can't move, you're more susceptible to those outside forces coming in and stealing from you. And so then you have to start thinking about how to defend your grain by building city walls, by creating a soldier class, and eventually maybe you hire other mobile pastoralists and warriors to go and attack the other ones or to protect you. And that's actually essentially the origins of the state, is the merging of animal and plant agriculture.
It's so interesting to me, especially relating to some of the past sessions we've had, which is when you move from oral embodied gestural communication to alphabetic written culture, you move from life as a verb, life as relational and embedded in an environment, to life that can be made into an object. And I'm really interested that you actually see the birth of this type of technology alongside the first granaries and accumulation of domesticated animals and grain in, I think, ancient Sumer. You see these tokens around the Euphrates. Lists don't exist in oral culture. They only exist when we start to accumulate things that we need to make as a list.
Totally.
And so what I'm thinking a lot hearing you talk about this is this movement from a life where there was a distinction brought up in another class that was talking about how we talk a lot about rooting in place, but we're also, stories move, myths move, and we used to move. And so we moved from this relationship that was not, and I think in the chat, people are calling this immediate return society lazy. No, it was actually inherently participatory. You had to be so awake and aware of the different cascades of where different things would be at a different time, how to correctly preserve them, that it was an incredibly present, engaged existence that took a lot of work. It took a lot of folklore and relationship with the land to remember where these things were at what time. And so we moved from this relational nomadic culture to this sessile object-related culture, where when we store food, it can become an object rather than a relationship and something that moves.
One of the things that I think a lot about is there's a really good chapter or essay at the end of this book called Domestication Gone Wild, which I both loved and hated. But the essay is by Anna Tsing. It's about how domestication is essentially a form of alienation. And that's because you're alienating the things that you're holding captive. I mean, really, it comes down to captivity.